Good morning. How is everyone? God, these camera settings make me look terrible. That's a bit better. Right, there's quite a lot of new subscribers. Many of whom have joined for Dragon Warriors or other things that I've been running online. Hopefully, get back to gaming streaming soon. I think I'm getting to the end of Xenoblade Chronicles, so we can hope. But I do a news show every Monday that I can be bothered and that there isn't something else happening. The shtick of which is that there are a lot of people on YouTube who do commentary who have no idea what they're talking about. So why not embrace that and just, other than the headlines, I haven't really looked at the stories I'm talking about. I'm relying on things that I've picked up and just talking out of my ass and trying to be a little amusing, I suppose, and get some sort of gauge on what the stories of the day are going to be. But coronavirus is the new Brexit. Brexit was all-encompassing. It was all we talked about pretty much for a very long time. I used to put the Brexit stuff at the end because of that. But I don't know. COVID's still fresh. It's affecting a lot of people, and there's a lot of important information to get out there about it. So let's see, what do we have in terms of news stories today? So the UK government, like a lot of governments that are woefully underprepared, has not done too well in terms of getting protective equipment and so on. We ordered a whole bunch of the shit from China that turned out to be no good in terms of testing, and in terms of personal protective equipment there's a whole load of stuff coming from Turkey, but that doesn't really tell us a great deal either. There's already shortages. This isn't likely to be enough, and some of it may be faulty. We're not exactly on good terms with with Turkey lately, so that's not likely to help. In the village, they've been collecting 60-degree washable material, particularly sort of man-made material, plastics, that sort of thing, plastic cloth, and certain types of thread and so on, and helping to make scrubs for local hospital. Whether that's any good, whether that's helpful at all, I have no idea, but it shows how people are coming together, but it also shows how desperate the situation is, and it shouldn't have been this desperate. People are saying that it's good that this stuff is supposedly coming, but bitter experience with incompetence has shown that until the gowns have actually landed, the boxes have been opened and checked, and the equipment's been tested, the NHS can't count on it. So you have to continue to proceed as if you're on practically zero equipment and hope for the best. There hasn't been a rapid uptick in how much stuff is being produced. A lot of the ventilators that are being produced aren't up to spec, aren't usable, aren't useful. So a lot of people are taking this to be an example of how the state isn't the answer. But it's not the state that's at fault, it's the people who are in charge of the state. If you look at the UK, we had plans, we had contingencies, austerity gutted the NHS. That was an ideological decision on behalf of one particular party. Funding cuts besides austerity, trying to beggar the NHS to the point where selling it off might become publicly acceptable. That's an ideological decision. Didn't take all of this very seriously at the start. That was an ideological decision driven largely by Cummings. The failures are party political. They're not on the part of the state, and there is no entity other than the state which is large enough and capable enough of dealing with problems like this. This is why it's important to have competent people in charge. Now, I might be an anarchist, but I'm a pragmatist, and realistically the best solution to these problems is currently, until we reach a post-scarcity society, the state. It's the best option. That doesn't mean eliminating the private option. God, people still misunderstand the differences between communism, socialism, welfare, all of these things. People just don't grok the language at all, or the meaning, or the terms, or how ideological definitions perhaps differ from what they think they mean when it's applied practically. But the problem isn't the state, it's the people in charge of the state. This is even more stark if you look over in the US, because they had a playbook for a pandemic, they had preparation, they had gear, all of this stuff. They had embedded epidemiologists and biological scientists all around the world in various places. Trump dismantled all of that, seemingly purely because it was part of Obama's legacy. And Trump seems to be driven almost entirely by vindictiveness and hatred for Obama. I mean, and now thousands upon thousands of people are going to be paying the cost, particularly if they open everything up too early. But these kind of things are likely to be a theme from now on, so let's see how things go, I guess. Right, you shouldn't have played in the background. Naughty, naughty program. Right. Finally, the UK government's furlough scheme is supposed to be going live, which was supposed to be covering up to 80% of workers' wages, up to £2,500 a month if they're put on leave from their job. This should have gone live a lot quicker, I think, and there was the delay in addition to that when it came to self-employed, such as myself, even though I've done my taxes rather promptly when I was asked. So we're probably looking on another week or another two before the self-employed even know whether they're able to get any help or not. Of course, they said by the end of April. Quite why this takes so long, I don't know. They're certainly quick enough off the mark when they want your money, a lot slower to give it back. But yeah. So this is coming. Now, I haven't paid too much attention to this. Apparently it falls on the bosses to do this. So if you're a worker who's been furloughed, your boss will will pay you, and they're up to this amount, and then will reclaim the money from HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, online from today, I think. Today's the 20th, isn't it? Yeah, so from today. And when it comes to the self-employment thing, I don't know. Part of the reason that's likely to be slower is because that they can't offload as much of the work onto bosses and companies, because if you're self-employed, you know, you're the boss, you're the company. Apparently what they're doing is they'll be looking at your self-assessment, how much tax you paid, how much earnings you declared, and so on, the previous year. So not this year, but the previous reporting period. My tax year runs from January 1st to January 1st, which is convenient for me, but it's off from everybody else. And then they'll pay you an amount according to how much you declared in that year. Again, I think it's 80%, but it's taxable. So we'll have to see how that all goes. My tax returns are very complicated and are about to get more complicated next year, so thank God I don't have to deal with that for another year. But yeah, the money should be coming. If it's not being sorted out, your first port of call should be your boss, your HR department. You know, even if they're working from home, those are the people you need to talk to and whinge at, not the government. And it's supposed to be starting from today, so hopefully that'll start to filter through. Don't know anything about the schemes in other countries. Can't help you there. So pollen season's starting. Hay fever is kicking off for a lot of people, and there's a lot of concern within the health services that everyone who gets hay fever, whatever, we'll start to get that, start to feel that, and we'll panic and think it's coronavirus, and we'll even further overload the system. So perhaps, maybe, watch some stuff online. The BBC site's got some stuff on this, so how you can tell the difference, or maybe take some antihistamines, and if they work, then it's not coronavirus. So that might be one way to deal with it. But yeah, be cautious and careful, and try not to overload the system in a panic. So that's important. So there have been protests all over the US against the lockdown. This is like pure Darwin Award territory. Lots of people gathering in one place to protest the fact that they're being contained for their own good. And lots of, don't tread on my rights. I'd rather, live free or die free, I guess, than live oppressed. Nobody's being oppressed, right? This is any more than a lot of other people like to claim they're being oppressed. This is a public health situation. There is a deadly pandemic that is killing a great number of people and is overloading the healthcare systems, leading to a lot of tertiary deaths, and it's being done for everybody's good. It's a health emergency. You can't exercise any of your rights if you're dead. And nobody is suggesting that this is anything other than a temporary state of affairs, and things will eventually go back to normal in some way, whether it's through a vaccine or whatever else. Just maybe the disease will go through its natural cycle, and then we can prepare vaccinations with a bit of breathing room. But doing this is thoroughly irresponsible. These people should have been arrested, but then prisons, breeding grounds for disease as well. People should be being released from prison at the moment, quite honestly. I mean, how do you deal with this kind of stupidity? There's no suggestion that this authoritarianism, this necessary authoritarianism, will extend any longer. And yeah, it's being done in a limited way for a very good reason. I think that, ironically, I think the problem we have with coronavirus is that it's not deadly enough. If this were Black Plague, Black Death sort of levels, if a third of people were dying with weeping buboes, and being bulldozed into pits, I think then maybe people might take it more seriously. But it's not. A lot of people are asymptomatic. It's picking off people who often have underlying conditions. So it may not be the coronavirus itself, but these other conditions that you have aggravated by it that's killing you. And that gives people the leeway to pretend that it's fake, or the numbers are being inflated, though here in the UK we're hearing that the numbers might be being underreported, and they're already bad enough. We already look on course to be one of the worst countries in Europe in terms of casualties and infectivity and so on, and they're apparently being underreported. It's just, what do you even do with these people? And then we're going to face more resistance when the vaccine does come along, but just because Bill Gates is an advocate for vaccination and has thrown a lot of his own money at I think it's 7 separate labs working on different potential vaccinations or treatments. Because it's him, that people sort of impugn his motives. Now, Bill Gates has not been a fantastic fellow in the past. He basically stole Windows when he was setting up his company, or at least he stole DOS, which was the basis for Windows eventually. Hasn't been the most moral and ethical individual in the past, but since he kind of retired from Microsoft, he seems to be going out of his way to rehabilitate his image and spend his money in a philanthropic way. Not the best. We shouldn't need philanthropy. We shouldn't need charity. We should be able to do these things without all that. via communitarian principles, but we don't. So, we'll take the help where you can get it. But people seem to think he wants to microchip people and that somehow swabbing their throats will be implanting chips, or they don't want ID or some kind of certificate that shows that they've had the virus and have fought it off and are no longer a danger and can't catch it anymore. These things aren't dystopian. It's all about context, and the context is that there is this deadly pandemic sweeping the world. Any country, any system can only be as liberal as it can afford to be, and in the current situation, the amount of freedom that we can afford is constricted due to this. Now, if I, an inveterate anarchist, can accept the necessity of this and the pragmatism of it, then I'm sure some lolbertarians can manage to understand as well. But it's just crazy. And there's all these other problems, like the people blaming 5G or whatever. And some people even think this might swing the election for Trump, which is just insane. I mean, is it Biden? That guy isn't the person to challenge Trump and to win against Trump, but the Trump administration's total mishandling of this should, in any reasonable circumstance, exclude them from office. But a lot of people are blaming their local governors, their local politicians and so on for the shutdown and buying into these conspiracy theories. Why this is such a problem in the States and so much of a smaller problem everywhere else, I don't know. Culture, bootstraps mentality, cowboy mentality, rugged individualism, or are Americans just credulous, uninformed and uneducated as a whole? I mean, there's always exceptions. Who knows? I don't know. This is just bloody stupid. They've even been blocking roads, which has been blocking ambulances, and a bunch of nurses have gone out into the street when they probably should be working. To prevent these protests from gridlocking traffic in the hospitals. There's just no accounting for stupidity, I guess. This is a bit of a weird one. It seems to have slipped by a lot of people due to all the COVID news. But there was a mass shooting in Canada. They don't happen anything like as often in Canada as they do in the States, but they do happen. But this is weird because during a lockdown, a national lockdown, someone's managed to kill 16 people in Nova Scotia. They were disguised as a policeman, which seems to have allowed them to get away with it for a bit longer. But the rampage went on for 12 hours or more, and only ended with a car chase. He shot people at several different locations before finally being killed by police after this car chase. He had a fake police car, fake uniform, all the rest of it. And even killed an RCMP constable. What was her name? Let's make sure we get that out there. Heidi Stevenson, who'd been serving on the force for 23 years, was one of the people killed trying to protect people. There's not a lot of details yet. You know how these things go, and getting more details is likely to be something that takes even longer in the current situation and is less likely to turn up in the news. So whatever you hear, I would suggest going and checking it. There's been hints at a motivation, but I haven't seen anything about it this morning. I'm sure stuff will come out later on. But then he just seems to have kind of lost it and gone around killing people. But it's grimly rather an accomplishment in the situation in which we find ourselves to even be able to manage a mass shooting. God knows what. Maybe he was seeking to enforce the lockdown. Who knows? I certainly don't know. But yeah, look out for more information on that. Disney, that wonderful family-oriented corporation that we all know and love, has decided to stop paying 100,000 workers during the downturn. So that means they're stopping pay for about half of its workforce, which will save them about $500 million a month. They have an operating income of $1.4 billion for their parks, experiences, and products, which is where I think most of this is related to, because those will be shutting down. But this does thrust a hell of a lot more people into de facto unemployment. And you would think one of the wealthiest corporations in the world, especially one with a family-oriented image to uphold, might be a little more forgiving or a little more helpful to its employees. But apparently not. Charities are saying, yeah, we've got help to offer people, but people aren't taking it up. So if you're having a hard time, call out to charities for assistance, because they are there and not all of them are at capacity yet. There are some that are at capacity, which tend to be the ones dealing with domestic violence, or intimate partner violence, or couples having issues. I know the Mankind Initiative is completely overwhelmed. They don't have as much capacity as the women's shelters and things. So tricky. Who cares what a star thinks about all of this? So there's a scheme in which companies top up pensions. So that kind of fills up shortfalls in people's pension schemes. Pensions aren't necessarily, even though you've been paying into them all of your life, they aren't necessarily the best, or don't necessarily pay out as much as people have thought. Companies have for a long time topped up pension payments and so on. That's stopping, at least while the coronavirus is here. So if you are still in work, or if you're going to get rehired again, I would tighten your belts for a bit longer and make up the shortfall in your pension payments. Several groups have already missed out on these. Trump, Boris Johnson, Brexit, now coronavirus. It's all just made readily apparent all of these cracks in our infrastructure, the way we do things, the way we treat people's employment, workers' rights, pensions. Every aspect of our society is being sort of put under the spotlight by this, and we can only hope that change comes in the wake of all this, without too much further disruption. It would be great if Trump got the coronavirus. Not because I want him dead or anything, but simply because having had the virus seems to have forced Boris Johnson to take things a lot more seriously and to soften a lot of his far-right rhetoric that got him elected, ironically enough. But he seems to be sort of once bitten, twice shy. The Tories were talking about a relatively early release of lockdown, in the same way that America has been talking about it. But since Boris has had it, they seem to have backed off away from that. We're already talking about a 3-week extension of the lockdown, probably a 6-week extension of the lockdown, and the language coming out of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet has been a lot more cautious. Basically, they're concerned that there could be a second surge, a second outbreak, essentially, and so they're backing away from their rather bullish take it on the chin stance, which is a good thing. So it would be good for the world and good for Americans if Trump similarly got infected. I think that would make a big positive change to the way in which America is tackling this. But we'll see. I think Trump's caught because the lockdown and so on isn't popular, particularly amongst his base, particularly amongst the right wing and the libertarians, and he wants to pander to them, but that will mean a lot of deaths. So what do you do? In a way, I'm glad that he is dithering, because it shows that somewhere deep down maybe in the cockles, maybe in the subcockle area, there is some scintilla of humanity left in the man and concern for other people, even if it's probably, well, if I don't lift the lockdown, then this group of people are going to be upset at me. But if I do lift the lockdown, then a lot of people are going to be dead, and even more people are going to be upset at me. So I get the impression he's that kind of calculating sort. One of the things that has been a problem is education. So, like, it's great that people can learn from home, but a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of kids don't necessarily have the resources necessary to be able to learn from home, which is a decent internet connection and a laptop. But if you're disadvantaged, you will now be able to borrow laptops in order to do your homework and do your lessons and so on from home. The Department of Education is also supporting free online lessons for primary and secondary pupils. Who is actually providing this? Is this Department of Education? Laptops or computer devices, so I'm guessing tablets, will be provided for some disadvantaged pupils in Year 10 who will be taking the GCSEs next year. There's no specified number of laptops available or a set budget, and be up to schools or local authorities to decide who needs help with access to a computer. Okay, so they're offloading a lot of it. They're also offering 4G routers, so mobile internet, which makes sense. It's got wider coverage than fibre and so on. So this is good. Something that should have probably happened before, but was previously only happening in charitable schemes. And it shows how even right-wing, ideologically possessed governments can embrace socialistic efforts, techno-socialism, fully automated luxury communism where necessary. So we just got to educate people on the level of necessity and demand that actually exists and how this can be better for everyone. Here's hoping. Electricity use during the day is up by about 30%, but people are staying in bed for longer. Is that or is that not more efficient than offices? Don't know. You got to take into account the travel that people aren't doing as well. So I think this has shown just how possible it is for many, many, many people to work from home, to not have to commute, for companies not to have central offices and so on. Could save a lot of money, save a lot of harm to the environment, prevent a lot of carbon. So one of the things I hope that emerges from this afterwards, I hope the new normal is a much more accepting and tolerant business attitude towards home work and remote working in general. Yeah, maybe have people come into the offices occasionally for meetings and things, but if you can work from home and your workload is, you're meeting your workload, why shouldn't you? And it would save companies a lot of money, it would save people a lot of money, which would reduce upward pressure on wages and so on as well, because if you're not having to run a car constantly, all of these other things, and it would relieve congestion. I've long thought that's a good idea, and I'm hoping that this is a proof of concept, but we'll see. One thing we're noticing, I think, is a lot of magical thinking around the virus. So on the one hand, you have people who think there's conspiracy theories behind it, or it's a bioengineered microorganism, or that 5G is somehow spreading it or causing extra mutations. It can't. It's non-ionizing radiation, 5G. Shut up. Go away. But equally, on the other side of things, you have people hoping for sort of miracle cures. And I don't just mean gargling apple cider vinegar or pointing a hairdryer down your throat. I mean, people are looking to things like AI and so on to solve it. We don't have AI. We have learning algorithms, and we have a lot of brute force computing, and that's great for doing things like simulating folding proteins and all of this sort of thing, and running models and so on. That does speed up some stages. that could get us to a vaccine or a decent treatment, but not all stages. And you still have to do trials. You still have to make sure it's safe. You still have to make sure it has an effect over and above the placebo and so on. There is no magic wand we can wave. There is no AI wand we can wave. And maybe that's something that those of us who consider ourselves to be futurists or transhumanists need to take on board, is that there is no magical wave your wand technological solution to things, and that even singularity style AI might not necessarily make that much difference when it comes to these complicated technological problems, particularly where they interface with psychology or biology, which is a bit tricky. Despite everything, and I really thought this would cause a much bigger delay, despite everything, NASA is going to launch the first crewed mission from the US in a decade, which is like, yay, no longer have to rely on the Russians. And this is a public-private partnership using one of SpaceX's rockets. So they're planning to send the first crewed mission up to the ISS in May, I think, due to take off from the Kennedy Space Center on the 27th of May, taking 2 astronauts to the ISS. Now, I'm in two minds about private rocketry. On the one hand, it's been good to see it driving innovation and to see it allowing for a continuance when a lot of people are hostile towards space exploration, wanting to concentrate on Earth and so on because they don't really understand the payoffs that we get from all of this. But I don't trust people like Elon Musk with private access to space. I think, like most things, you need a balance between the public and the private. And I would be concerned, particularly as the capabilities of SpaceX and similar companies continue to increase. Yeah, how long before they start doing things entirely independently, and will there be sufficient oversight? Will there be sufficient public buy-in and observation of what they do? But no longer having to rely on the Russians or whatever else is a good thing. So I'll be looking forward to that, and I really thought the space program would be knocked back a lot more than it has been. There's that law, isn't there, that any headline that ends in a question mark, the answer is no. So, coronavirus, is there any evidence for lab-released theory? No. In fact, it's a genetic breakdown and examination of the virus that has now taken place in several countries. Unfortunately, it now comes in several strains as well, which is something we've discovered. But suggests that no, it doesn't have any of the markers that we would expect of an engineered virus. It seems to be entirely natural and zoonotic, which means stemming from animals. So the short answer is no. It's almost certainly not some kind of artificial release. So put that to bed. There's been an interesting poll that suggests, only in the UK unfortunately, but suggests that most people want to change their lives in some way after the pandemic. Only about 10% of people say that they want things to go back to normal. Most people want some kind of change and hope that we've learned from this as a country and a society. Lots of people have noticed that the air is cleaner. Many people say that they've seen more wildlife. Many say that there's a strong sense of community and a connection with their neighbours that they haven't had in a long time. And many people are actually more in touch with their friends and family using technology that they maybe shied away from before. So it's kind of weird that this separation has made a lot of us closer to our friends and family, which is very odd. More people are taking up cooking. There's been a boom in bread making. All of these many people are exercising more. Weirdly, the lockdown is actually improving a lot of people's quality of life and giving them larger expectations of what they want from their life, and demonstrating to them that a lot of things are possible and that there is still value in your local community. I think a lot of this is rose tinted. I've essentially been a digital native since about 1995, living most of my life online, and I've found plenty of community and so on, either before or after this crisis, in my global community of friends. So I think people are perhaps overstating that and being a bit nostalgic, but a lot of people seem to have an appetite for positive change now. Whether that happens or not, it's really down to us more than the state. We have to, well, more than the ruling parties, we have to demand it. That's the part of it I'm more concerned about, is whether there's sufficient will and sufficient effort to push it all through. We talked about hay fever. Some people have suggested supplementing NHS staff with additional money, the same way that we do for deployed military. So that would be an extra £29 a day. It seems reasonable to me, especially since so many NHS workers are chronically underpaid. So, and it is equivalent to war zone deployment, I think, in a lot of ways. So why not? So the only question then is, where does the money come from? Well, it turns out there are magic money trees when it comes to bailing out companies and trying to prop up the stock market to no avail. Was Trump's $1 trillion into the US stock market basically staved off some of the rate of collapse for about 12 hours. Seems to me that there are better uses for $1 trillion or however many millions of pounds than that, and helping NHS workers seems like a good bet. I mean, one of the things we're going to come out of this with, I think, is more appetite for healthcare reform in the US, and the NHS is likely to come out of this practically untouchable. There's already a lot of love for the NHS in this country. That's now gone through the roof. It would be political suicide for the Tories to continue to undermine. So we'll see how that ends up going. Right. This one's complicated, and I did talk about it in a video I did, I think, last week, possibly the week before. Ethnicity and the coronavirus. There has been some suggestion that people of Eastern extraction might be more vulnerable to the coronavirus than people who are Caucasian or African in their racial makeup. At least there was early on. I haven't heard a lot more about that. But we are seeing now that there are, statistically, at least in Western nations, a lot more casualties amongst the African American, Afro-Caribbean communities. And a lot of people try to turn this into a racial issue when the statistics aren't really there, that they're more or less vulnerable by ethnicity. This was something that was bandied about, as I said early on. Which means you have to look at other reasons. But they are now recording coronavirus cases by ethnicity, which is kind of buying into the idea that our societies are somehow congenitally racist. Or that our medical systems are biased. And that's a very simplistic point of view, and it's divisive when we should be bringing people together. Because a disease, it really is the great leveller. Everyone's vulnerable. Anyone can get it. Boris Johnson getting it kind of demonstrates that, I think. What we have are underlying social issues which aren't really about racism, but they are about poverty and lack of social mobility. So if you look at, say, for example, because I know it better, if you look at the Afro-Caribbean or just Anglo-African community in the UK, we have a high proportion of immigrants. Immigrants tend to be poorer because they're immigrants. They've just come over here, often with nothing. They're often working in essential but low-paid jobs like delivery or gig economy stuff, healthcare, sanitation, these kind of things. So they are still working, and so they're more exposed in that way, and they have less access to healthcare, sometimes due to immigration status, less so here in the UK, but in the US that's true. Less money, less opportunity to avoid work or to stay home or to cope otherwise. These are all things that increase their risk that have nothing to do with being black per se. If we compared like for like, if you compared the poor white precariat with the poor black precariat, I suspect the numbers would be a lot more similar in terms of infections and deaths and all the rest of it. Because, and this is what infuriates me always about the kind of woke pseudo-left, is they forget the economic underpinnings of most left-wing theory, and they buy into this identitarian politics, which only feeds the right and buys into the same kind of problems and stupidity that right-wing white identitarianism does. So while this information is useful, right, because we want to track by as many ways as possible, we want as much information as possible about infectivity and infection rates and death rates and all the rest of it, you just know that this information is going to be misused and abused by people, both the far-right white identitarians who are going to try and claim that black people are vectors of disease or something, and by the pseudo-left identitarians who are going to try and say, oh, this is all down to systemic racism within our countries and our societies, and they're forgetting about the economic side of all this, which is a huge fucking shame and is just going to add division when we should be bringing people together. Right, that's pretty much everything. I will just see what you guys have been saying. So if you've got any comments or questions, hit me up. Jack says, have you seen anything the Daily Wire crew are saying about the lockdown in the USA? It'll make your head explode. No, but I can imagine, but I like my head where it is. Thank you. So I won't go looking on purpose. Felbrigg says, I bet they're still paying the billing department of the Disney housing establishment. Probably. Felbrigg says, I think we need to release the lockdown, but with a new normal that takes account of precautions against all viruses. Masks, remote working, social distancing, cleaning, hand washing, pervasive. Yes, but it's still not the time to release the lockdown. I think we're at peak. The US might be another week away from peak. That's the worst time to release the lockdown, so we need to hang on for a bit longer. So, but after that, we need to partially, slowly release the lockdown, I think, with all these precautions in place. If we can get widespread antibody testing and so on, that's been the big problem. That makes it a lot easier to let people get back to normal. We'll see. Felbrigg says, if the Wuhan lab was involved, it was probably just some bod delivering a bat to them and dropped a cage rather than an escape from the lab. Right. So, Wuhan is a big area. It's a big city that this initially was detected in. As big as New York, I believe, if I'm remembering the statistics correctly. There are probably several biolabs within that city, just as there are several biolabs within the extended area of New York and within London and so on. It's basically meaningless to go, aha, look, there was a biolab in Wuhan. Yeah, and there were probably several. Most large cities will have something related to this in or around it. So it basically means Jack and shit. And Jack caught the virus and died. Uh, Jack says, speaking of Jack, there's been a boom in bread making, said Grim, as I took an abruptly self-aware bite of my homemade toast. Yeah, our bread machine's been in use, though it's gotten very hard to buy flour, partly because of the boom in home bread making, but also because the companies that are making bread, sliced loaves or whatever, they've seen a huge surge in demand and they're buying up all the supplies. So you're kind of being whacked from both sides there. But yeah, homemade bread, nom 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 nom. Falbrick says, no magic money tree is the biggest lie. All money is all lies and fabrication. Yeah, essentially. I mean, even gold, which crazy people get far too invested in, I mean, it has a few practical values, but the value that we place upon gold is entirely artificial and subjective. So, what's she going to do? Vorpal Anvil says, of course, different ethnic groups are affected differently. Now, there's no of course about that because it's so tangled up in all these other issues. Like, the virus is likely to be far deadlier and nastier in Africa, which is starting to spread across, because so many of the countries are poor, not because they're black. Right? Now, there may be some very slight differences in infectivity and deadliness by race. It may have adapted to the Chinese population to start with, but the racial differences in genetics are so minuscule they only ever really come into effect at the extremes, and that's as true for medicine as it is anywhere else. So, for example, people of West African descent tend to have more high-speed twitch muscle fibers, which is why so many sprinters come from West Africa or the Caribbean or America, because West Africans were enslaved, sent to the Caribbean and to the States, and so yeah, there's that. But that only really comes into play at Olympic level. And similarly with medical differences, it's only at the kind of extremes of medicine that racial differences really come into play at all. So things like organ rejection, things like that. And even then, it's only very slight, but it's statistically significant for the people who suffer. So if you're mixed race, it can be slightly harder to find a compatible donor. Organ rejection is more likely, things like that. But it's only by a very small amount, and it's only in those extreme cases. So there's no of course about it. There is an of course about poverty levels and how technologically developed your country is and whether it has a socialised healthcare system. Yeah, those kind of things. Those all mean a great deal. A hell of a lot more than race. Right, I should get on with work. I've got a ton of stuff to do. Unfortunately, I've been kiboshed by some... Well, I say unfortunately, but... Fortunately, maybe, I've been kiboshed with some people wanting me to do some video work for them. So all this time on YouTube has finally paid off. But it's going to distract me from writing my new book, which is what I really want to be working on. But hey, I will see you all around. Take care, everyone. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell, and make sure you click to get all notifications, because apparently that's what you need to do these days. Take care, everyone. Have a good one. Don't get anything infectious. Zang.